Good morning, church. A few days ago, I was in line at the grocery store. And even though the self checkout can save time, and I often use it, my preference is to go through the checkout line with a real life cashier. In a way, it almost feels nostalgic to be in line, to place the groceries on the conveyor belt, to sit there and decide whether or not I should buy a Snickers bar, and then interact with the cashier. So, anyway, while I was in line, I looked to the person to the left of me, and this person was also in line, and she was leaning on her buggy, and she had her phone out, and she was just kind of flipping through it. I don't know if she was looking at Facebook or Instagram or whatever it might have been, but she was just kind of flipping through her line, probably out of boredom as she waited there. I looked over to the self checkout area, and it was kind of busy, so there was actually a line for the self checkout as well. And I looked, and there were people doing the same thing. They were sitting there flipping through their phones. And I was sitting here and I was looking at this, and the thought popped in my head. I don't think that this is good. Anyway, out of curiosity, I looked up how much time we spend on our phones. I didn't use my phone for this. I felt a little convicted, so I'm like, oh, I'm going to actually use my computer and make sure I look it up that way. I don't know if that's any better, but anyway, that's what I did. And here's what I found. Starting with boomers, the average American baby boomer spends 3 hours and 31 minutes on their phone each day. Gen X will spend 4 hours and 9 minutes. Millennials will spend 4 hours and 36 minutes. And Gen Z will spend a whopping 6 hours and 5 minutes a day on their phone. Estimated time on a smartphone for non-voice related things. A lot of us, including me, will use our phones to make actual phone calls. So if you take those out of the equation, in 2019, the average American, now this is all generations, spent 3 hours and 45 minutes on non-voice related things with their phone, whether that be apps, looking at the internet, GPS, text messaging, 3 hours and 45 minutes. Fast forward to today, 2024, the average American will spend 4 hours and 49 minutes. Now, the amount of time spent on the internet alone, so you can say, well, let's take out phone calls, let's take out text messages. How much do we spend on the internet? Now, whether that be on Safari on an iPhone or Google on a Android or whatever the case may be, you're looking at internet searches, you're looking at apps that use the internet, whether it be a banking app or whatever. In 2011, I know that was a long time ago, but 2011, the average American would spend 32 minutes on their smartphone using an internet-based thing. In 2024, that number has increased to 3 hours and 50 minutes. And you might say, well, we do that instead of looking at a computer. Well, when you add in desktop, laptop, and tablet internet usage, the average American will spend 6 hours and 40 minutes on the internet. That's an awful lot. At least it seems like to me. Now, before I start my criticism, and before you get aggravated at me, I want to acknowledge that many of us have to be on our phones for work. There are other unavoidable reasons that we have to use phones, and there are even reasons that I'm glad that I have had a smartphone. In fact, I'm that guy who probably uses his GPS too much, but I'm thankful to have a GPS to navigate me from here to there. One more thing I want to say, I understand that some of the time that we spend on our phone might be what we call displaced time. That is, instead of wasting time watching television, we waste our time looking at something on our phones. But regardless, I think that the data that I shared above shows that we have a problem. And even if it predates the smartphone age, in which I think it does, the problem certainly seems to be growing. Whether good or bad, technology is infiltrating every area of our life. However, I think it's safe to say that many of us have a problem, and that our connections to our smartphones have reached an unhealthy level. I'm not an expert, but it seems that we have a nationwide issue that affects both the young and the old. In fact, from what I understand, phone and app developers design things in a way that encourages more and more phone usage. And I can only imagine that with AI coming into the picture, that they're going to find ways to make phone usage go even higher. So what does this mean for Christians? As Christians, I think we should take every thought captive. So when I think about this, how should we as Christians approach this? Now, I think this is a discussion that needs to be much longer than the time I have here, but I do want to point out three things that I want you to be aware of. Number one, our time is short. In 1 Corinthians 7:29, Paul makes a case for prioritizing Christian service because our time is short. Whether Paul is referring to the return of Christ being soon, or whether he's referring to our lives just being short, we have brief lives. The point is that we are called to prioritize our service, our lives to the service of God. Now, you may be different from me, but my phone usage is not always efficient. I find myself wasting time on my phone, sometimes out of boredom and other times just out of a desired distraction. But if it's true that our time is short, and it is, then we have to be careful of our time, and that includes not mindlessly wasting time on our smartphones. Number two is service to God, and I've already mentioned service to God, but Jesus tells us that we cannot serve two masters. So when it comes to being beholden to our phones, which could be a phone addiction, or it could just be compulsive use, we run the real risk of serving another master other than God. Now, Jesus in that passage in Matthew chapter 6 was referring to you cannot serve both God and money, but I think by application we can look at it in relation to this and say that we cannot serve both God and our smartphones. My third one, and one that I think is particularly important, especially in this age where information is so readily gathered and perhaps misunderstood and not gathered correctly, we have to guard our minds. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 says that we should watch over our hearts with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. We have to be careful of what we bring into our minds. It's no secret to say that phone and app developers design things in a way that encourage phone usage. There are psychological tricks that can be used to keep people digitally engaged. People have known of many of these tricks for a long time, but the smartphone seems to be using these tricks on a daily or even hourly basis. It seems like there's no break from the manipulation. Once upon a time, we were forced to reflect. We would have to sit alone in a waiting room. We would have to drive our car without much of a distraction other than maybe turning the radio on. Yet today, we often stay away from downtime by grabbing our phones and checking it and flipping through this and looking for that. And we don't allow ourselves much time for reflection, for real deep thought, and perhaps most importantly, prayer. And all three of these things God has given us so that we can guard our minds. I hope you think and pray about this issue. I want you to ask yourself, am I spending too much time on my phone? If not, are you spending too much time on something else that could be better spent glorifying God and to produce more goodness, truth, and beauty in you and your life's family? I want to encourage you that the time is short, so we need to be careful with it. I want to encourage you to be intentional with your service to the Lord, and I encourage you to guard your mind. I'll be praying for you. Please pray for me. I'll see you next week.